In 1978, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. The average Chinese citizen earned less than $200 a year. Most families lived in tiny rural homes with dirt floors. Food shortages were common. Meat was a luxury. Electricity was unreliable. Modern appliances were almost non-existent. China produced very little the world wanted to buy. At the time, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and South Korea were already industrializing. China was still overwhelmingly agricultural. Nearly 80% of the population worked on farms using hand tools little different from those used centuries earlier. Factories were inefficient. Technology was outdated. Productivity was painfully low. For decades, China had tried to build a socialist economy cut off from global markets. The state controlled prices. The state owned factories. The state decided what got produced and where it went. The result was stagnation. By the late 1970s, China's economy was barely growing. Hundreds of millions of people remained trapped in poverty. After years of political turmoil and failed campaigns, the country was exhausted. Many foreign economists believed China was hopelessly backward. Too poor, too rural, too bureaucratic. There was no realistic path to modern wealth. Then everything changed. In December 1978, Chinese leaders made a decision that would quietly reshape the global economy. They abandoned the idea that the state could plan everything. Not overnight. Not publicly, but structurally. Instead of trying to control every factory and farm, they decided to unleash incentives. Farmers were allowed to sell extra crops for profit. Small businesses were quietly permitted. Local officials were rewarded for economic growth instead of political purity. For the first time in decades, effort meant income, and the results were immediate. Food production surged, rural incomes rose, markets reappeared. But this was only the beginning. China's leaders understood something critical. Farming alone would never make the country rich. If China wanted to escape poverty, it needed industry, factories, exports, foreign technology, global markets. Just like South Korea and Japan before it. So China did something that shocked the socialist world. It opened the door to capitalism. Not fully, not politically, but economically. In the early 1980s, China created special zones along its coast. These were places where foreign companies could invest, hire Chinese workers, and manufacture goods for export. Taxes were lower. Regulations were lighter. Infrastructure was built at lightning speed. Inside these zones, China essentially ran a different economic system. Factories sprang up almost overnight. Western and Asian companies rushed in. They brought machines. They brought know-how. They brought global supply chains. China provided something even more valuable. Hundreds of millions of workers willing to work long hours for extremely low wages. For multinational companies, the math was irresistible. Producing in China was far cheaper than producing almost anywhere else. And for China, every factory meant jobs, skills, and foreign currency. Exports exploded. In 1980, China's exports were about $20 billion. By 2000, they were over $250 billion. 2 decades later, they would exceed $3 trillion. China was turning into the workshop of the world. But cheap labor alone wasn't the secret. Plenty of poor countries had cheap workers. Most never industrialized. What made China different was scale, discipline, and state coordination. The government didn't just open the door and hope for the best. It built highways, ports, power plants, and cities at a pace the world had never seen. Entire industrial clusters were planned. One city for electronics, one for textiles. One for appliances, one for machinery. Supplies were placed next to factories. Housing was built next to plants. Ports were expanded to move goods instantly. Costs fell. Speed increased. Efficiency soared. China wasn't just making cheap products. It was making them faster and at massive scale. Then came the next phase. Just like South Korea before it, China began climbing the industrial ladder. It started with toys, shoes, and clothing. Simple assembly work, low skills, low margins. But over time, Chinese workers became more experienced. Factories reinvested profits. Technology improved. Soon China was producing steel, chemicals, appliances, ships, and electronics. By the 2000s, it was manufacturing computers, smartphones, solar panels, and high-speed trains. Each step moved China into higher-value industries. Each step raised productivity. Each step increased incomes. But none of this would have worked without people. China invested massively in education. Literacy became nearly universal. Universities expanded at historic speed. Millions of engineers, scientists, and technicians were trained. By the early 2000s, China was no longer just a low-cost manufacturing hub. It was becoming the center of global production. Walk into any major retailer in America or Europe at the time and flip over the label. Made in China. Toys, electronics, furniture, tools, clothing, appliances. Entire supply chains have reorganized around Chinese factories. Multinational corporations didn't just outsource production. They built ecosystems. Component suppliers clustered around assembly plants. Ports expanded to handle container traffic at record volumes. Rail lines connected inland provinces to coastal export hubs. China wasn't participating in globalization. It was reshaping it. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Chinese companies were learning. At first, many factories simply assembled parts designed elsewhere. Foreign firms supplied blueprints and technology. Chinese workers provided labor. But over time, knowledge accumulated. Engineers studied imported machinery. Managers optimized processes. Local suppliers began producing higher quality components. China moved from assembly to integration, from integration to design, from design to innovation. The government accelerated this shift. Strategic industries were identified: semiconductors, telecommunications, renewable energy, artificial intelligence. State banks provided financing. Research parks were constructed. Universities expanded engineering programs. This was not accidental. China understood a hard truth. If it remained only the world's factory floor, it would stay dependent. Margins would stay thin. Profits would flow overseas. To become truly wealthy, China needed control over technology, so it invested heavily in research and development. In 1991, China's spending on research was modest. By the 2010s, it had become one of the largest R&D investors in the world. Patent filings surged. Technology startups multiplied. Venture capital flowed into hardware, software, and biotech. Companies that once copied began competing. Telecom equipment manufacturers grew into global suppliers. Consumer electronics brands expanded beyond China's borders. E-commerce platforms built massive domestic markets before expanding internationally. At the same time, the government pushed urbanization at extraordinary speed. In 1980, less than 20% of China's population lived in cities. By 2020, that number exceeded 60%. Hundreds of millions of people migrated from rural villages to urban centers. Cities offered factory jobs, construction work, and higher wages. Urban workers spent more. Consumption increased. A domestic middle class began to form. Apartment towers rose across the skyline. Subway systems expanded. High-speed rail networks connected distant provinces. China built more highways in 2 decades than many developed countries built in half a century. Infrastructure wasn't just about convenience. It lowered transaction costs. It made logistics faster. It linked inland labor pools to coastal ports. It allowed companies to scale nationwide. The speed was staggering. Entire neighborhoods appeared in months. Industrial parks materialized where farmland had stood. Container terminals expanded year after year. Critics questioned whether the pace was sustainable. Supporters pointed to results. Growth remained strong. Poverty continued falling. Exports kept rising. But rapid expansion created imbalances. Local governments borrowed heavily to finance construction. Property development accelerated. Debt levels climbed. China's model relied on investment. Investment required credit. Credit expanded quickly. For years, this fueled growth. New factories meant more output. New apartments meant more construction jobs. New rail lines meant faster trade. The economy became increasingly complex. No longer just export-driven, China began relying more on domestic demand. By the mid-2010s, China stood at a new crossroads. The era of easy growth was ending. For 30 years, expansion had been powered by three forces: cheap labor, massive investment, export demand from the rest of the world. Now all three were changing. Wages were rising. Global markets were becoming more competitive. Debt levels were climbing. The very engine that had driven China's rise was beginning to strain. Factories that once relied on endless streams of rural workers started facing labor shortages. Younger generations were less willing to work 12-hour shifts on assembly lines. They wanted office jobs, service work, urban lifestyles. At the same time, property construction had become one of the economy's biggest drivers. Local governments sold land to developers. Developers borrowed heavily to build apartments. Families invested savings into real estate. For years, prices kept rising. Construction boomed. Employment surged. Growth stayed high. But beneath the surface, risk accumulated. Developers carried enormous debt. Banks expanded credit rapidly. Shadow lending grew outside formal regulation. The system worked as long as prices rose. If they stalled, the pressure would surface. Meanwhile, China's relationship with the global economy was shifting. For decades, foreign demand had fueled factory output. But after the global financial crisis of 2008, growth in Western countries slowed. Consumers bought less. Trade expanded more slowly. China could no longer rely on exports alone. The government responded with massive stimulus. Trillions of dollars flowed into infrastructure, housing, and industry. Highways multiplied. Rail networks expanded further. Cities grew faster. This prevented a sharp slowdown. But it also increased debt dramatically. Total borrowing across government, businesses, and households surged. Investment kept growth alive, but it became less efficient. Each new dollar of credit produced less economic output than before. The economy was getting bigger, but also heavier. More complex, more leveraged. At the same time, China's global position was changing. It was no longer just a manufacturing hub. It was becoming a technological competitor. This brought new tensions. Western governments grew concerned about intellectual property. Companies worried about losing market access. Trade disputes intensified. Tariffs were introduced. Supply chains were questioned. The easy era of globalization was fading. China's leaders understood the risks. If growth slowed too sharply, unemployment could rise. Social stability depended on continued improvement in living standards. But relying on debt and construction forever was not sustainable. The economy needed another transformation. Once again, the strategy shifted. The focus moved toward innovation, consumption, and technological self-sufficiency. Factories were encouraged to automate. Robots replaced manual labor. Productivity became the priority. At the same time, policies aimed to boost domestic spending, higher wages, expanded social services, better healthcare coverage. The goal was to reduce reliance on exports and investment. Households would become a larger driver of growth. Meanwhile, advanced industries were promoted aggressively. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, biotechnology, semiconductors, massive funding programs were launched. Research institutions expanded. Talent recruitment intensified. China sought to control the technologies that powered modern economies. Not just manufacture products, but define the next generation of them. At the same time, regulators tightened oversight of risky lending. Some property developers were allowed to fail. Debt was slowly reined in. Growth cooled but did not collapse. The economy entered a slower, more mature phase. Instead of 10% expansion, rates moved closer to 5%, still high by global standards. Its cities rivaled the skylines of the richest nations. Hundreds of millions of people who once lived in poverty now live middle-class lives. Homes had running water. Children attended universities. Families owned cars, appliances, and smartphones. Life expectancy had risen dramatically. Hunger had largely disappeared. This was not a small improvement. It was the largest increase in living standards ever recorded in such a short time. But the most remarkable part wasn't the numbers. It was how it happened. China didn't rely on a single reform. It didn't follow pure free markets. And it didn't remain a centrally planned economy either. Instead, it built a hybrid system. Markets were unleashed where incentives mattered. The state intervened where scale and coordination were needed. Exports fueled early growth. Investment built infrastructure. Education created human capital. Industrial policy pushed the economy up the value chain. Every phase prepared the next. Cheap labor funded factories. Factories funded technology. Technology funded innovation. The economy constantly evolved. When agriculture hit limits, industry expanded. When simple manufacturing saturated, advanced production emerged. When exports slowed, domestic consumption grew. When imitation reached its ceiling, innovation became the focus. This adaptability was the real engine of China's rise. There were costs: environmental damage, high debt, inequality between regions, periods of inefficiency and waste. But overall, the system delivered growth at a pace never before seen. From 1980 to today, China's economy expanded more than 40 times in size. Few nations in history have experienced anything close to this. Even the industrial revolutions of Europe and America unfolded far more slowly. China compressed centuries of development into decades. It did so by learning relentlessly. It studied Japan's post-war recovery, South Korea's export strategy, Western financial systems, global supply chains, then adapted each lesson to its own political and social structure. Nothing was copied blindly. Everything was modified for scale, for discipline, for speed. The result was an economy capable of mobilizing resources faster than any other in history. Highways appeared in months, factories in weeks, entire cities in years. Where other countries debated, China executed. Where others waited for markets to build infrastructure, China built it first. This created momentum. Momentum attracted investment. Investment created jobs. Jobs raised incomes. Incomes fueled consumption. Consumption supported new industries. The cycle reinforced itself again and again. By the time growth began slowing, China had already reached upper middle income status. It had already industrialized. It had already built technological capacity. It had already lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. Slower growth now meant expanding from a massive base, not stagnation. A 5% increase on a $1 trillion economy is modest. This is why China's rise was not a miracle. It was a long, disciplined process of building systems. Systems that invested relentlessly in people and infrastructure. Systems that adapted when old models reached their limits. China got rich the same way every industrial nation ultimately does. By producing, by learning, by reinvesting. By moving steadily into higher value work. What made China different was speed, scale, and coordination. No country had ever attempted development on this magnitude, and no country had ever executed so quickly. In just one generation, China moved from poverty to global economic power, from isolated farms to high-tech cities, from food shortages to manufacturing dominance, from being written off as backward to reshaping the global economy. The story of how China got rich is not a story of ideology. It is a story of incentives, infrastructure, education, and adaptation. It is the story of turning labor into industry, industry into technology, technology into long-term growth. And above all, it is the story of how building the right systems can transform a nation, not in centuries, but within a single lifetime.